So for the final segment of the show, we've been talking a lot, Rod, the last few weeks. People who are watching, tuning in, have tuned in a lot to our coverage of the suit against NASCAR over the charters.
Hmm.
There was a development last week, just a minor thing, in a development just in a court filing. Nothing's been decided yet. But the suit filed by Front Row Motorsports 2311 Racing, that's primarily Bob Jenkins at Front Row and then Michael Jordan at 2311, along with Denny Hamlin and some others.
Hmm.
They sued for a preliminary injunction that would allow them to compete in NASCAR next season as charter drivers while the suit plays out in court. The important part of that is, I mean, theoretically, they could compete as open teams, but there's a fear expressed by both teams that, hey, NASCAR already can purchase and create for themselves charters, and there's 30. Those charters give you a guaranteed spot in a race, and that perhaps NASCAR would just, you know, create enough of those charters internally that would box them out. And even then, if they could get some open spots, it's the economics of racing as an open team just don't work out very well.
Right.
So what they're hoping to be able to do is sign the charter, but also still be able to continue with their lawsuit. They're asking for an injunction. Nothing is what I've seen. Nothing's been decided on that yet. They're only seeking a ruling by the end of the year. But this is a development here. They would actually then end up signing the charters and still fighting it out in court.
Yeah. And I think that that's probably the way that they need to go right now. At least try to, show some, how can I say this, just cause of why they should be there, why they should be racing based upon what they've been able to contribute. But it's kind of got me to this point this week of where I've really thought about it in the week since we were on the last podcast, and I've really thought about it. And to me, I'm not taking a side out of this for 2311 as much, but I'm also looking at the NASCAR perspective, and I'm almost comparing NASCAR to the NCAA. And when I say that, I'm comparing them to the NCAA. It's almost one of these things of where you have NASCAR extending out these things to say to race car teams, to teams in general, this is what you have to do to be able to be legitimate in our sport. Okay. So as I look at that and compare it up to the NCAA, it's the same thing of how you would look at maybe a team, for example, several years ago. A lot of people scratched their head and wondered why in the world would Appalachian State want to join Division One? They were dominant in the one AA ranks as they referred to it. Why would they want to go and bump up to Division One? Well, I think they proved to a lot of people that they belong there. They're not having a good season this year, but they belong there. But still, the cost to maintain a college football team, as you've talked about with James Madison, and then also with the attendance at UVA at the football games and so forth, all of these things are determining factors if whether or not you're going to have a legitimate program or not, if your program is going to succeed. So what does it boil down to? It's money. It's the big thing. It's money out of this thing. And the way I look at it is, almost in a way, I think like, okay, you shouldn't have a charter to be a participating member in NASCAR. And I think if you're going to go, and those numbers, I think years ago we had this big discussion. Several friends and I did. It was right when Tony Stewart and Stewart Haas Racing came into being, and they wanted the number 4. And the number 4 had belonged to Morgan McClure Racing, which was, not far from where I live at. And Larry McClure, who was already out of the sport, kind of claimed that he still owned the number 4. You can't own a number. And then here he is. He says, well, why is Stewart Haas taking that away? That number has meant a lot to us. Well, if I recall correctly, I think they also ran a dual car one year. I think they ran it with the '04. I was first thinking it was the 14, but no, they ran it with the '04. But they claim to hold on to that number. You don't hold on to that number. And I don't think it should be that way in the sport. I think if you file for a number, yeah, you get that number and you stay with that number as long as you have a race team, as long as you are racing every week. But then if you decide to pull back and you're not in 3 races or 4 races or whatever the case may be, You don't have claims to that number. You don't have claims to that number in particular. But it's just another way of, well, to say it, no other way around it. It's just another way to goose and pull money out of that golden goose, thinking that you're going to be able to, uh, hey, we're set. We don't have to worry about it. And it's also along the lines, and I think I've mentioned this to you before. It's nothing short of extortion. I think it's extortion in the way of, the price that these teams are having to pay, come up with this money, knowing full well you and I have provided the breakdown of how much it costs to run a team year after year, and it could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. People don't look at that, but they just look at, are they there? Are they going to race? The fan doesn't know really what's going on. And the fan knows that my favorite driver should be out there every week. If he's not out there, then he belongs somewhere else with another race team, or he needs to be doing something else. It just reminds me a lot of extortion. It's almost like NASCAR is forcing these teams to play by their rules in order to have a full house, to where they go and they have, set amount of teams every week, and they eliminate these pretenders, if you want to call them that, from showing up at the track and saying, we want to race this weekend. Sort of like the old days. You'd have 45, sometimes 50 cars trying to compete for 42 starting spots, I think, for the race. And now that's kind of been eliminated. Now you don't have this sort of thing of, this stuff of, racing and trying to go through all this stuff, and then provisionals championship, championships, provisional, however you want to define it. You don't have Darrell Waltrip in the heyday of his career relying on a past championship to make a field in a race every week. You don't have that. So I kind of look at it as almost like an extortion thing. And sorry I've gotten so long-winded about it, but it's just kind of the way I feel about it. It to me is like extortion.
When I was researching this particular story last week about this injunction that was filed for, I ended up just diving into this whole issue of charters and learned a lot more than I ever knew. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's fascinating to share some of it for people who like me maybe didn't know. I certainly didn't know until I researched this last week. The charter system only dates back to 2016.
Right.
Um, the Before that, teams operate on year-to-year contracts,
Mm-hmm.
and which was just the difficulty there was you weren't guaranteed entry into races, you
Right.
weren't guaranteed a share of TV or gate money, and you were competing with NASCAR for sponsorships. NASCAR might, if you're the number 11 M&M's car, M&M's might also have cut a deal with NASCAR, and they're giving NASCAR itself money that they're not giving to you, and so
Right.
the teams actually asked for something that was a little more concrete than a year-to-year contract. And so
Mm-hmm.
NASCAR came up with the charters in 2016. That first charter was a 4-year charter. It was automatically renewable for one term, so through 2024.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what that did was give a certain amount of money guaranteed, and also guaranteed you a spot in the race, as we talked
Mm-hmm.
about. But teams with the renegotiation that we've been covering in depth the last few months wanted more of that share. Well, the deal is now NASCAR is distributing 25% of the TV money from the new $1.1 billion a year deal to the charter teams. NASCAR then gets 10% and the tracks get 65%. But as we've noted not a lot,
Mm-hmm.
NASCAR owns most of the tracks. So
Yep.
that's double dipping there a little bit.
Yep.
Um, and as it turns out, so I found a story where Curtis Polk, a co-owner of 2311 with Jordan and Denny Hamlin, he told Auto Week that basically what they have found in discovery in this lawsuit is that NASCAR is bringing in about $3 billion in revenues a year, and they're this new charter system that's starting, with the charters that were signed earlier. I guess it was last month. Will
Mm-hmm.
distribute about 400 million a year, so that's 13% of the revenues.
Yep.
Overall, out of those overall revenues, the drivers make about average of about 3 million a year. So that's 100 million a year. That's 3% of that $3 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Basketball, football, baseball, they all get the players get 50% of the revenue. So it's a huge discrepancy here. It's to a point too where I found in another article, Front Row Motorsports, actually they filed this in their lawsuit. They said they've been in existence since 2005, so this was their 20th season.
Right.
Never turned a profit. Never turned a
Yeah.
profit in 20
Mm-hmm.
years. That's how you almost ask, why do you continue running a business that doesn't turn a profit? I mean, everybody
Right.
starts a business and it takes a few years to get to profitability. 20 years isn't a few years.
Well, and I would say this: the profitability that took place was probably for some of these teams, it was maybe by several dollars, maybe several cents back in the 80s and the 90s and everything before NASCAR really started getting so big. But then again, we're talking about a TV contract that now a lot of people are starting to scratch their heads about. Like this came up. This is one thing that came up, and I don't see this. I don't see this happening. If it does, then we're going to change the way that sports are done. I mean, COVID did some things. COVID messed some things up. These guys were doing races from Charlotte. That's where they were setting at. They were either at the racetrack or they were in a studio and they were calling the race by visual from all the cameramen out there. Next year, the CW, it's been reported next year that the CW is going to put their announcers in house in Charlotte calling the races. And Dale Earnhardt Jr. is having a fit over it. He's like, they don't deserve this. The sport doesn't deserve this. If you're going to be there, you've got to be there. That's the way he feels about it. It's the same way that I think about the money deal. This whole money deal about this TV rights thing, give or take about 8 more years or 6 more years, whatever it's going to be. But I see NASCAR getting into this thing all on their own, and they're going to say, to heck with the networks. And then where's all the money going to be? Well, it's going to be coming into NASCAR. It's going to be NASCAR Digital, NASCAR Media, NASCAR, all of this. And are the drivers going to get anything of this? The teams or anything? Probably little to none is what they're going to get. So you have to credit Denny Hamlin, Michael Jordan, Curtis Bond, those guys, and the guys with Front Row Motorsports for stepping up and saying we want to challenge this because we feel like it needs to be fair. And I think Denny Hamlin's quoted somewhere of just simply saying it's not fair. The situation is not fair, and I don't know how else you can say that, but sometimes we have to take our licks. We have to go and we have to, accept some things. They may not get everything what they're wanting this time around, but they're putting NASCAR on notice. They're telling NASCAR, hey, we're done being screwed over. You need to go and show us a little bit of respect out of this thing. Quit taking us for granted that we're going to run every race all year and so forth, because if you do this, we're not going to do it. We're not going to go on. And it also opens up the possibility, will there be, quote unquote, another sanctioning body come into play? And I mentioned that rumor to you a couple of weeks ago about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia supposedly has been in talks or discussions with some people about making this a little bit more of an involvement involving the Saudis. I don't know, but it has the possibility of being what? Taken internationally, something that NASCAR has not done up until this past year, and they're only going to Mexico to do it. So, we could see NASCAR go to foreign soil for the first real time ever if the Saudis have anything to do with it. But that all remains to be seen just yet. That's all just a lot of speculation at this point.
I just did a quick thing on the calculator here. We've talked about how we've seen different numbers saying that it costs
Mm-hmm.
around $40 million a year to put a car on the track, keep it on the track. I get
Right.
it. There's 36 charters, so 36 times 40 is $1.44 billion. They're getting right now, according to Curtis Polk in that interview with Auto Week, the teams are getting around $400 million out of
Mm-hmm.
NASCAR from this new charter deal. So that's the $1 billion that the
Yeah.
teams need to make up in the difference to be able to keep their cars on the track and not lose money. If NASCAR were to say, you know, here's the $1 billion. NASCAR then would still have more than half of the revenues that NASCAR
Right.
brings in. They'd still be getting about 55% of the revenues, which would actually be in line with what the NFL does, owners do
Mm-hmm.
there, NBA, MLB, NHL, in terms of sharing with the driver. They're players, I guess I could say, and that it would be a very similar, equitable way of doing things. As it is, $1 billion that the teams need to come up with just to break even. That
Yeah.
that's yeah. It's this is if NASCAR can't figure out a way to balance its books any better than that, maybe this business isn't viable. That's the other thing to this.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we are seeing tracks that don't have lots of empty seats. I mean, the TV ratings aren't what they used to be. So, that's this the existential future of the sport could be on the line here.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think it could be. Another thing that you brought up too. You're talking about the NFL, and I don't. I have never really researched this, and I've never really looked it up. It gives me something to maybe talk about before next week and think about. What about these drivers and their careers afterwards? What do we do with these drivers, or what do these drivers do? A lot of them probably have to put a little bit back in their kitty just to be able to have something in order for them to be able to be successful later on. You've got Brad Keselowski, who has gone into racing business, so to speak, with Jack Roush and Fenway Group, and they have made RFK Racing. Denny Hamlin's looking on the out, looking at the future. Maybe when he's not in the sport, what's he going to be doing? But we've not really thought about what happens when you have a driver like a Kurt Busch or a Steve Park or an Ernie Irvan. And I'm throwing some names out there that have been tragically, seriously hurt in the sport, even though I know they make this choice on their own. But how is their health care? How is their health care planned for the future and so forth? And you've got to say one way or another, what happens if Dale Earnhardt Jr. comes up here in the next few years and says, because of all of his concussions, that now he's starting to forget things and he's starting to go into an ALS, dementia, whatever it might be. What's the sport going to do? I mean, Dale Earnhardt Jr. probably can do okay taking care of himself. He's got enough. I think they've got enough money, but still, what's that whole thing about your finances, and also for medical in case something were to happen? It could be outrageous. And I think of Ernie Irvan. Ernie Irvan slapped the wall at Michigan. They thought he was going to die. He tried to make a racing comeback, but I know he's got issues. Even to this day, I know he's got issues. Memory issues are one thing. The second thing, he's probably got some kind of breathing issues and stuff, because I mean, he was in bad shape. Steve Park, we see him occasionally, but Steve Park does not come to the races as much as he used to because of his concussion and his head injury that he had. How's he being taken care of? These are things that if you're going to contract with NASCAR and you're going to run, NASCAR at least ought to be able to provide some sort of quote unquote pension to these guys to help them out. That would be acceptable, I think. If I were going to drive and I qualify for a pension after, say, 15 or 20 years from racing or something like that, I think that would be justifiable. But I don't hear anything about that. I just hear of how much it's putting in NASCAR's pocket, how much they're doing, what they're doing themselves, and what's the driver getting out of this. What about the teams? What about the teams? If they get injured, somebody gets injured, somebody gets hurt. I know they have insurance on that regard. They have team insurance and everything, but what if they have a permanent disability afterwards? I saw just the other day there was an NHRA team member, I think, who had to have a double lung transplant. I believe he's with Erica Enders' team. It's that elite motorsports team that they have in NHRA, and his bills were going to be so much that the elite motorsports teams had bound together to start a GoFundMe account to help this guy out. Now, I would think that that's something that needs to be taken care of too in NHRA, but we're not even close to that same thing on NHRA as to what we're dealing with here with NASCAR.
That is an incredible point that I had never thought about either. But I have read extensively. I think one of the books behind me on my bookshelf here is almost like a Bible of the history of the baseball union movement,
Mm-hmm.
called Lords of the Realm. And I read this book. It's probably dates back to the mid to late 1990s. but about the history of the baseball union movement. And so often what we think about when we think about the baseball union, the unions in NFL, NBA, ML, the NHL, we think about, okay, what the guys are making now.
Hmm.
But much more important, because for every guy that you hear about making 50 million a year, LeBron James making whatever he's making, Tom Brady, whatever he made,
Hmm.
most athletes, most baseball players, football players, basketball players, hockey players are league minimum guys. And now that
Hmm.
still might be $1 million a year, but you take taxes out, you only make it for a year. It's not life changing money. You still got to have a
Right.
job afterwards. And so, the unions and what they've done to provide for pensions, as you mentioned,
Hmm.
for long term health care. I mean, in the NFL, the players union had to sue over the CTE issue, and
Right.
they had to settle for they decided to settle for a amount of money a lot less than they probably should have,
Hmm.
just because they didn't want to fight in court for 20 years. There are similar type lawsuits in other sports. UFC, there's a pending settlement there in the, I
Yep.
think, low billions of dollars. um Combat athletes really get screwed.
Hmm.
Professional wrestlers, even though it's sports entertainment, not a sport, they get injured a lot. They don't have pensions. They don't have health insurance paid
Right.
for by the company. So, yeah, NASCAR, there's no way there's anything in place because, yeah, we've talked about this a lot, Rod, how the France family said years ago, we're not going to do a union. If you
Yep.
want to do a union, you can just go somewhere else. And so, if there's no union in place to provide these benefits, there's no money there for them. And that's a basic thing. And so even if they got one in place now, even
Mhm.
if this lawsuit leads to something like that now, what is that going to do for the last 75 years of NASCAR? All those guys, a few women, who have, long-term effects because of all
Mhm.
the racing they did. And, we didn't know about concussions until the NFL a few years ago, but drivers certainly have been suffering from concussions from all those crashes, the bumps and bruises into walls, into each other
Yep.
for 75 years.
Yep.
And there are retired drivers that sitting out there who are dealing with the long-term effects. How do we pay for them? So, man, you have opened up a Pandora's box there.
Well, and I think about this too, and some people will say, okay, well, they put a helmet on, they get into this car, they get into a form fitted seat, they know what the risk is every time. But you mentioned it just then. These guys hit the wall. Now, it's not like that they're sitting in a seat in a race car and they are just unbound and their head just goes wildly up against the roll cage or anything inside of the car. We're talking about concussions of where they hit with so much force that the brain actually collides with the bone itself of the skull and then comes back. And once that's damaged, I mean, you have that, then that's a spot. But then after continuous slams over and over or damage of that sort, it effectively almost in a way just kills part of that brain. That brain just not as is not as effective, and it depends on where it's at. I mean, folks, let's remember something here. Dale Earnhardt Sr. died at the hands of his neck and his head being snapped from the impact. If he had had a Hans device on, there's a lot of people that said he might have made it through and we might have had him, another 25 years or so, either as a car owner or as a driver. But folks, it didn't work out that way. And this is something that, yeah, you take your risk each and every week when you get into a race car. And heaven forbid we have a time like what happened with, at Charlotte and Fireball Roberts and, the situation there of when I believe he had the wreck and wreck blew up, fire everywhere and stuff. And Ned Jarrett talking about being helpless to be able to do anything about it. Rescue crews at that time couldn't get to him. But you would say he died loving, doing what he loved, and that was race car driving. But these guys, for them, mostly now, it's more of a job than it is a passion. Some of them, they will claim it's a passion because that's what they've been involved in, but it's their job. It's their job now. And, I think if you're going to be in a job that requires you to be in a situation where your head could go up against your skull and beat you senseless, you need to be compensated for it just in case later on down the line, some kind of pension out of it. I think that's what you need to have. But, I go back and I think to myself, John L. Lewis in one way was right. Taking care of the families and so forth of the person that's injured or whatever, and taking care of them for the rest of their life and the way it's supposed to be. It's a great thing, but trying to get people to live up to that because of the cost and the economy and everything else with that, it's kind of hard to believe that we're still talking about this right now of money, health insurance, pensions, and so forth, and how expensive it is to have those things.
I'll say that as much as guys sign up for it, NASCAR signs up for it too, and every
Yeah.
every little racetrack in the country that has racing, part of the cost of this should
Hmm.
be taking care of the folks. And it's not even the I mean the hard hits. It's just like in football. The hard hits are the
Hmm.
ones we see, and you used to see the replays of and say, "Wow, that was a hard hit. He got a concussion there." What we've learned, one thing we've learned about CTE, which is a contributing factor to, everything from ALS, Parkinson's disease, dementia, et
Hmm.
cetera, is okay. Yeah, the big hit is certainly something that can be an issue. Like for Tua Tagovailoa has had a couple of really disastrous concussions that probably make it so he should probably never play football again.
Right.
But they're just as dangerous are the ones that don't look bad, but the smaller ones that add up over time. The linemen who hit each other, they're hitting each other on every play.
Hmm.
And so those suboptimal hits that add up that you don't even they're kind of the silent killers. And this I would say the
Hmm.
same thing for a NASCAR driver. So yeah, the big one. The ones you see, I'm not naming the names here because I'm forgetting, but the really spectacular one where a guy gets hurt, taken to the hospital, etc. But it's the lesser ones maybe that we don't even necessarily think, okay, that guy needed to go to the hospital. He needed to be treated. He was there for a few days, but it's the one that he has, and then a couple months later, there's another small one. Maybe a year later, there's a little more mild one,
Hmm.
and then the accumulated damage that's done there that adds up to a big one. But they're maybe worse because you didn't have that one dramatic one that sent you to the hospital, made you get brain scan tests, have a
Exactly.
baseline, have testing afterwards. And then you have the effects, and people wonder, well, what's wrong with that guy? He never had a
Right.
big one. And
Right.
so those are the ones I look at. And plus, the safety that you have in NASCAR now have had for the last 20 years, 30 years isn't what it was back in the 60s and 70s when they
No.
were riding around in cars that weren't much different than what we drive around in now. And so I worry about again those drivers too, that are maybe in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and have been having issues for a long, long time. And NASCAR's forgotten them because they haven't contributed to the sport for 30 or 40 or 50 years.
Yeah. Well, and I think of you know, probably wasn't long after that, I guess, is when they brought the window nets in. But I look back on that video, the film that's been digitized of Richard Petty at Darlington doing the barrel roll, coming, turning over, and then if you catch it in a glimpse, you'll see an arm flopping outside of the car and stuff, and yet he lived to tell about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know that he's been through heck and everything and stuff. He's had, surgery on his stomach. He's broken bones, all these different things. There will be people that will, first thing that will say, he chose to do it. Well, that's right. He chose to do it. But that's the only thing Richard Petty's ever known. That's the way he grew up. That's just the way he was around this with Lee Petty. And that's where we stand at today with it.
But NASCAR chose to provide the venue, and
That's
NASCAR
right.
made money off of it.
That's
And
exactly right.
NASCAR, as an entity, owes it to the people who participate, help them make all that money to make sure that they're taken care of after the results, just like the NFL
Exactly.
does for its players, and every other sport does for its folks too.
Well, and you mentioned this too. It's the little ones. It's the little ones more so than the big wrecks. I have been at times. I've been at some of the racetracks, and when I have been around, or at least been watching and seen some of these guys after a wreck, whether you watch it on TV, whether or not you watch it live in person, I've seen guys get out of the car and literally not know where they're at.
Yeah.
They'll come out and they'll stumble and they'll want to go somewhere else. And then the safety crew is there to grab them real quick and then take them on board. And then within 30, 45 minutes later, they get there and say, "Oh, I'm okay. I just got rattled a little bit." Well, how do we know you're really okay? Because you staggered out of that car. I mean, I would be staggering. I'd probably be puking, after a hit
Yeah.
like that and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And especially that much force, I'd probably be heaving my guts out. But, you're more of a man than I am, at that point, but you're still staggering around like you don't know where you're at. So something's got to be wrong. Let's go through this whole thing of checking them out. And I think that a lot of these things have just not materialized on the radar. But, hey, this is stuff that 2311 is starting to bring to the forefront. I think they're bringing it up there because nobody has really ever questioned NASCAR the same way that nobody had ever questioned the NFL over all of these hits. And maybe it's time. And like I said earlier too, you said it also. The thing about the NFL and the hits, the helmets, and so forth, they didn't get exactly what they were wanting, but hey, they at least told some people, hey, we're watching this, we're being serious about this, and something needs to be done. Maybe that's the same thing what 2311 is about to expose a little bit more in this so-called, as you called it, Pandora's box that we're opening up here.
You know, it just comes to mind that the NFL used to sell those videos of the hard hits.
Oh, I
And they
know.
haven't done that for a long time, have they? Because
No.
that's all those are like exhibits in court now.
And I find it hard to believe that some of these guys, as murderous as they were when they played football back in those days, um, I think up until probably before he passed away, Ray Nitschke had a great mind. He could tell you things. I had a chance to meet him one time, and he could tell you things that just make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, and because he made it that vivid. Art Donovan, I've watched old videos of him, and it's like, how in the world has this man got a mind, and him being such a hard hitter on the line, and then here he goes and he can rattle off these jokes and he can rattle off these comments, and he's just not himself. But we don't see them after the time and the point where they start into the decline. We don't see that out of them. And then you're left wondering, scratching your head, hey, what happened here? I thought they were in great shape, or at least they were 20 years ago. But yeah, time has a way of changing us before it's over with. And these little things that we may have ignored uh 20 or 25 years ago come back and they haunt us to a certain degree. And that's what it's done with drivers like Steve Park. And I can say this too. I'm a recipient, and I'll say this, of a concussion, and I don't think the best in the world sometimes. There's sometimes that I don't think the best. I don't make reason sometimes with things. I'll tell you truthfully, I'm not a test taker. I'm not a test taker. Used to, I could go in, I never had to worry about a test. But ever since that's happened, there's just something about me that just is not right. It's just not there, and so forth. But can you get people to kind of take that into consideration? No, because they say, well, it's your choice. You made that choice. Here, that's where we have the difference here. NASCAR, they're actually making some money off of it as opposed to, somebody else just going out there and doing it for the passion of it. There's a little bit of a difference with it.
NASCAR is doing the same thing. It comes to mind to me as what Amazon's doing. Amazon
Nah.
and Walmart both
Yeah.
are companies that have the highest number of employees on welfare.
Hmm.
They're not paying the full cost of their employees' lives.
Right.
And as a result, we pay for that.
Yep.
When a NASCAR driver or an NFL player does not have access to health care and they've had injuries from their sports, whether they signed up for them or not, they did. But
Hmm.
if they can't meet those and a GoFundMe can't pay for them,
Right.
we pay for that.
Yep.
Everybody else pays because somebody's got to pay the bills. And so, um, all we're doing here and I say we, I mean, all Michael Jordan and Front Row Motorsports are doing here, among many things. NASCAR is making money. We're not saying NASCAR shouldn't make money in their
Right.
lawsuit. They're not saying don't make money. They're saying we're making money. Just share it more. Just share it more with the drivers. Share it more with the teams. You the private France family shouldn't keep it all. When drivers are going underpaid, when teams are underpaid, when there's never even been a discussion, Rod, that I've ever seen publicly about what we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes about pensions and healthcare for drivers.
I haven't
Yeah.
heard it either.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what made me think about it to bring it up because it was just this is something that I think needs to be included. Forget about the charter stuff. The charter stuff is minuscule compared to this thing of money. How much does a team have to go and be able to produce revenue wise in order to keep a team running? But at the same time, if you're going to go and quote unquote with this charter contractually agree that you're going to drive for this many years during this period of time, you ought to be at least provided with something like a pension or something of some kind of health care or whatever it might be. And it shouldn't come out of your pocket, even though it's going to come out of our pocket because the race fans are going to the races and they're paying for all this stuff. But ultimately, it's the sanctioning body's responsibility out of it. And you don't hear them talking about it. And this is the truth. I've never heard it talked about. And that's the reason why I was kind of reluctant in one point to kind of bring it up today because I was like, oh, should I really get into this pension thing and stuff? Because it's never been mentioned. And, you took it and you ran with it because that's exactly one of the things that's concerned me for years, especially with the sport of NASCAR.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the topic. So for people who've listened to this the last 20, 30 minutes, you have heard the first, and you're going to see some more reporting on this from us, from Team AFP, on this issue because it's important.